major demands that I recall coming from Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders around those years were for recognition of their territorial rights, their rights to land and the resources of those lands. And also non-discrimination, to be treated fairly, to be treated on the same basis as others. My name is Garth Nettheim. I made connections with Hal Wooten in 1970, whom I'd scarcely met beforehand, when he had been appointed Foundation Professor and Dean of Law at the University of New South Wales, the second law school in the state. Around about 1970, he was also engaged with the establishment of the Legal Service, which we'll be talking about. So when we opened the door for the law school, two of the key players in the establishment of the Aboriginal Legal Service were admitted as students. One was Paul Coe and the other was Gary Williams. You know, it was extraordinary because it was very much based on volunteer effort at the beginning. We decided that what was needed to help people out of this situation was to have a telephone number that they could ring and get legal advice and or representation. So we were developing the plan for a roster of people who would volunteer to be available over a 12-hour period or something, someday during the week. That would be the telephone number. They would be at that telephone number, be able to, and they would have a list of volunteer solicitors, volunteer barristers. Hal wrote to every member of the Bar Association and of the Law Society, at least in the metropolitan area, asking whether people would be willing to volunteer. And we were very impressed with the extent of the feedback we got. A lot of people did volunteer. So the notion was that somebody who was interrogated, taken by the police, could ask to make a phone call for legal advice. They would call the contact person. The contact person would refer the caller to an appropriate solicitor, usually a solicitor at this stage, to get advice and representation. That was the scheme. But it was around about this time that we were trying to set up this rather cumbersome, awkward arrangement of teams of volunteers and things like that, that we had the offer of money from the Federal Minister, Billy Wentworth. Initially, the University of New South Wales Law School was established in what were known as the huts. These were old army huts on the lower campus. The University of New South Wales had one initially, and then I think two, maybe three, in the 3 years before it moved into one of the taller buildings, one of the larger buildings. So they were accommodated initially in one of the huts when we had the funding and could employ people. So that's where they were, and we would have our meetings and so on around that. Well, we were able to employ full-time people. We were able to employ a lawyer, by definition non-Aboriginal, and a admin officer and a support person. One of the first things we were engaged in the second year of the law school was the rugby union tour by the Springboks. There had been growing antagonism against apartheid in South Africa. Some of us had been involved in that previously, through the previous years. And this led to a campaign based on anti-racism, which was influential. This had been building up, and the Springbok tour was pretty well the crunch point as far as Australia's sporting relationships with South Africa were extended, until apartheid was eventually demolished. So a lot of things were happening in those years of the 60s, because I knew very little about Aboriginal issues in Australia. But in 1962, I linked up with the body established by a leading QC called Ted Sinchen, called the South Africa Defence and Aid Fund, SADAF. It was a branch of the International Defence and Aid Fund, which had been founded in London. But it was designed to provoke knowledge and awareness of and opposition to the apartheid system. So I was on that, and I think I was secretary of it for a year or so, for several years. It was an observer at trials. And this educated me personally, particularly on issues of racism. And then I began to realise that there were some problems in our own country. And my first focal point for working on these issues, apart from assisting in the early years of the Aboriginal Legal Service, was some academic work I did on the Queensland legislation under the Bjelke-Petersen government, which took a lot of years to dismantle. Some of the international developments in the United States, in relation to South Africa and elsewhere, were very influential in persuading Australians to start taking a look at what was going on in their own backyard. I think these notions are important. They were not always understood very clearly, certainly not by the wider community. Self-determination still is rather difficult to assert in Australia, but it was incorporated in critical international human rights documents. So what was going on at the United Nations in particular was extremely important in developing these concepts. Aboriginal people, very soon after the Working Group on Indigenous Populations started its meetings in the early 1980s, started going from Australia to their meetings. The first meeting was attended by one guy, a guy called Shorty O'Neill, who I'd met in Palm Island. Marcy Langton, I think, was at the second meeting of the Working Group. The next year there were about 5 people there. And over the following years, when it started work on what recently was achieved with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, there were strong inputs from Australia as well as from other countries. So I think the international legal developments have played a very significant role. Concepts of self-determination, but also many other concepts. The concept of self-determination was a little subtle for some. The major demands that I recall coming from Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders around those years were for recognition of their territorial rights, their rights to land and the resources of those lands. And also non-discrimination, to be treated fairly, to be treated on the same basis as others in terms of economic, social and cultural rights as well as civil and political rights. I think these were the 2 major thrusts where the international law was a basis of support for the arguments. I mean, the experience with the founding of the Aboriginal Legal Service was fed into the medical equivalent. So we got the medical service and so many other services developed. What was interesting was with the change of government at the end of 1972, with Whitlam coming in, monies were made available so that more similar services could be established where needed around the country, and they could establish their peak bodies, which became very important advocacy tools for Indigenous Australians. In reflection, I think the fact that how I was able to pull together a range of people, a mixed range of people, excellent people who were able to achieve what was first of all, a rather cumbersome design for the delivery of legal services to Aboriginal people, and then with the help of Commonwealth Government funding became a much more rational way of doing so. I think it was a huge breakthrough.